Solomon is remembered as the wisest man who ever lived, the builder of God's temple, the poet of Proverbs, the king who made Israel golden. But the biblical text itself tells a darker story. By the end of his reign, Solomon had built temples to foreign gods, enslaved his own people in labor gangs, and taxed the northern tribes into fury. Within a generation, everything he built was torn apart. How did wisdom lead to ruin? Let's start with what the text says about Solomon's marriages and why they mattered so much to the biblical writers. 1 Kings reports 700 wives and 300 concubines. Those numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Ancient Near Eastern royal rhetoric routinely inflated such figures, but the pattern is real. Each marriage sealed a political alliance with Egypt's Pharaoh, with Phoenician Tyre, with Moab, Ammon, and Sidon. Every wife represented a treaty written in flesh. These marriages carried a theological price. Foreign wives brought foreign cults. Solomon built temples and high places for Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of Ammon, on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Syncretism, the blending of different religious practices, physically encircled the temple of Yahweh with competing worship sites. The Deuteronomistic historian, the editor who shaped the book of Joshua through 2 Kings, according to Deuteronomist theology, likely in the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, delivered a devastating verdict. This syncretism was the reason God decreed the kingdom would be torn from Solomon's line. Note, this verdict may reflect a later editorial perspective. What 10th century Israelites tolerated as normal diplomatic practice, 7th century reformers under King Josiah found intolerable. The Deuteronomistic historian wrote backward from the kingdom's collapse, finding its theological cause in Solomon's compromises. The text is simultaneously historical memory and theological argument, and learning to read it as both is essential. Syncretism wasn't Solomon's only departure from Israel's ideals. To fund his golden age, he built a machine of extraction. Corvée, a system of forced labor imposed by the state on its own citizens, conscripted tens of thousands for building projects. He carved the land into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for provisioning the royal court for 1 month per year. Heavy taxation drained the countryside. Here's what makes this devastating. Centuries earlier, the prophet Samuel had warned Israel exactly what a king would do. He will take your sons for his chariots. He will set them to plow his ground. He will take the tenth of your grain. You will cry out because of your king. Solomon fulfilled every single warning. Now, before we go further, we need to ask a hard question. How much of this grand picture is historically accurate? Archaeological evidence paints a more modest portrait. Jerusalem remained a small settlement until the late 8th century BCE, when refugees from the fallen northern kingdom swelled its population. The grand Solomonic capital described in 1 Kings doesn't match what excavations have found in the ground. This doesn't mean Solomon was fictional. It means the biblical portrait is a literary construction built on a historical kernel. The sharpest debate centers on 3 sites: Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. All 3 have impressive 6-chambered gates and monumental architecture. 1 Kings 9:15 credits Solomon with building at all 3 cities. Traditional chronology dates these structures to Solomon's reign in the 10th century BCE. But archaeologist Israel Finkelstein's low chronology pushes them a full century later, attributing them to the Omride dynasty of the 9th century. Same stones, different stories. The stakes are enormous. If Finkelstein is right, Solomon's kingdom was far smaller than the Bible describes. The debate remains unresolved. Even so, some elements of the biblical portrait find plausible support. The Queen of Sheba's visit in 1 Kings 10 likely reflects real trade connections with Sabean territory in South Arabia. Solomon exploited Israel's position on north-south trade routes, developed a merchant fleet with Phoenician king Hiram. and traded through the Red Sea. Gold, spices, precious stones flowed into Jerusalem. The scale may be exaggerated, but the pattern of trade-based wealth is archaeologically supported by Phoenician commercial networks. Whether the scale was grand or modest, the consequences were real, and they expose a fundamental tension at the heart of Israel's identity. Israel's older tribal system placed God's covenant at the center. Charismatic judges, priests, and prophets led as needed. The 12 tribes operated as rough equals. Built-in mechanisms preserved economic equity. Sabbatical years released debts every 7 years. Jubilee years redistributed land every 50. Solomon's monarchy replaced all of this with a rigid hierarchy. King at the top, bureaucracy below, 12 administrative districts feeding the court, a standing army, corvée labor, heavy taxation. The result, a new class divide, urban elites versus rural poor. The covenantal ideal of equality was dismantled from above. Israel's experiment with monarchy was always in tension with its covenantal theology. Solomon represents the moment that tension became irreconcilable, and the consequences arrived immediately after his death. Around 930 BCE, the northern tribes approached Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Their request was simple: lighten the burden your father imposed. Rehoboam consulted his advisors. The elders counseled mercy. His young courtiers counseled force. Rehoboam chose force. His words became infamous. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. The 10 northern tribes seceded under Jeroboam. The united monarchy, the kingdom David built and Solomon expanded, was finished. 3 converging forces drove this rupture. Religious syncretism gave the Deuteronomistic historian the theological cause, God's decree of division. Corvée and the taxation created the political mechanism. Northern grievances too deep to ignore. Class stratification betrayed the tribal egalitarian ideals that defined Israel's identity. These 3 streams converged when Rehoboam refused relief, and the kingdom fractured into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Read 1 Kings, chapters 9 through 12, alongside 1 Samuel, chapter 8. Watch how the Deuteronomistic historian constructed a literary arc where Samuel's warnings become Solomon's reality. The biblical text is both a historical source and a theological argument. The kingdom has split. Next, we follow the 2 kingdoms on their divergent paths and meet the prophets who rose up to challenge them.